Everyone thought they knew what happened when Elvis Presley came home from the army. They were wrong. The story most people carry, the triumphant return, the hero's welcome, the king reclaiming his throne, is a carefully constructed performance, a public relations masterpiece built by people who had very specific reasons for controlling the narrative. What lay underneath that performance was something far more complicated, far more painful. A young man carrying a grief so vast it had restructured his entire psychology. A secret relationship that would define and ultimately devastate 2 lives. And a career that had been quietly, methodically dismantled by the one man Elvis trusted with everything, while Elvis was still overseas, still in uniform, still grieving. The truth about what the army years did to Elvis Presley is more human and more heartbreaking than anything the legend ever allowed. March 3, 1960, Fort Dix, New Jersey. The temperature that morning hovered just above freezing. A gray winter sky pressed down over the base as buses pulled through the gates and military police worked to hold back the crowd that had gathered, reporters, photographers, fans who had driven through the night just to be there. Inside the processing center, Elvis Aaron Presley, United States Army Serial number 53,310,761, was completing his final paperwork. In a matter of hours, Sergeant Presley would become, once again, simply Elvis. The cameras caught everything: the dress uniform, the easy smile, the handshakes and the salutes and the brief, carefully managed press conference where Elvis said all the right things in all the right ways. He was grateful. He was proud to have served. He was looking forward to getting back to work. The footage was broadcast across the country by that evening, and every frame of it told a story. Just not the true one. What those cameras could not capture, what no camera ever could, was the interior landscape of the man standing behind that smile. In the 23 months since Elvis had shipped out to Germany, his world had been shattered and reshuffled in ways that had fundamentally altered who he was. His mother was dead. A 14-year-old girl in Germany was waiting for a promise he had made in a moment of profound vulnerability. His manager had spent 2 years engineering a transformation Elvis had never agreed to, and the music industry that had crowned him king was quietly, efficiently preparing to hand him a very different kind of crown, one that glittered just as brightly but cost him everything that made him extraordinary. In the next 34 minutes, we're going to go behind the newsreel footage and the official story. We're going to examine 5 revelations that together paint a portrait of Elvis Presley that is more honest, more complex, and more devastating than the one most people carry. We'll uncover the private grief that broke him before he ever left American soil. We'll look at the relationship that formed in Bad Nauheim and what it really meant. We'll examine what Colonel Tom Parker was building in Elvis's absence and who paid the price for it. We'll revisit one of the most extraordinary recording sessions in American music history and ask why the world was never allowed to fully hear it. And we'll arrive, finally, at the moment on a Hollywood soundstage when Elvis Presley said aloud, quietly, to a woman he barely knew, the truth he could never say anywhere else. Close your eyes for just a moment and place yourself there. Fort Dix, March 1960. The smell of cold concrete and military-issue wool. Somewhere across the base, a radio is playing, and the song coming through the static is an Elvis Presley record. A record made before Germany, before the loss, before everything. The man stepping off that bus can hear it too, and something in his expression, just for a fraction of a second before the cameras find him, tells you everything. He recognizes the voice, but he no longer quite recognizes himself. To understand what Elvis Presley brought home from the army, you have to understand what he left behind, and not in Germany. What he left behind was on a hillside at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, 6 feet of earth over a white casket, his mother's name on a headstone, and a guilt so comprehensive, so all-consuming, that the people closest to Elvis would spend the rest of his life watching it quietly devour him from the inside. Gladys Love Presley died on August 14, 1958. She was 46 years old. The official cause was a heart attack, and that is accurate as far as it goes. But those who knew Gladys, those who had watched her in the months leading up to her death, understood that the heart attack was the final chapter of a longer story. Gladys had been deteriorating steadily since the moment Elvis was drafted. She had never been a robust woman. She had spent her entire life working grinding, physical, poorly compensated labor, and the decades had taken their toll on her body. But it was the emotional strain that finished her, the fear for her son, the disruption to the world she and Elvis had built together, the deep, bone-level anxiety that had plagued her since Elvis's fame had first exploded in 1956 and shown her, in vivid and terrifying detail, exactly how fragile everything was. Gladys Presley was not simply Elvis's mother. She was his center, his anchor, the one relationship in his life that was entirely unconditional, entirely without agenda. Elvis's biographer Peter Guralnick would later describe their bond as almost singular in its intensity, a closeness that was occasionally described by outsiders as unusual, but that both Elvis and Gladys understood perfectly. They were, in a very real sense, the primary relationship in each other's lives. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was a kind but limited man who had never fully inhabited the role the family needed from him. It was Gladys and Elvis, always Gladys and Elvis, facing the world together. When Elvis received emergency leave from Fort Hood, Texas, in the first days of August 1958, he knew before he arrived that his mother was in serious trouble. The calls home had been telling him things the words weren't quite saying. There was a tone in her voice, a thinness, a distance, that frightened him in a way that no amount of fame and attention had ever prepared him to handle. He arrived at Methodist Hospital in Memphis on August 12th. Gladys died 2 days later. At 3:15 in the morning, Elvis was at her bedside. What happened in that hospital room in the minutes after Gladys drew her last breath has been described by those present as the most raw, unguarded moment Elvis Presley ever had in front of another human being. He collapsed, not metaphorically, physically collapsed across his mother's body, sobbing in a way that had no performance in it, no awareness of audience, no management of image. He had to be physically removed from the room by hospital staff. Vernon Presley stood in the hallway, shaking, unable to speak. And the Memphis Mafia, the small constellation of friends and associates who orbited Elvis wherever he went, stood at a distance, helpless, watching the most powerful person in their world come completely undone. At the funeral, held on August 15th at Forest Hill Cemetery, Elvis wept openly throughout the service. He leaned over the casket and whispered to his mother. Those standing nearby could not hear the words. They didn't need to. The expression on his face was its own testimony. Afterward, he told his cousin Billy Smith, one of the few people in his life who had known him before fame, before the records, before any of it, "I lost everything, Billy, everything that matters." Billy Smith later recalled that he didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. He understood, as everyone close to Elvis understood, that something had ended that day that could not be restored. The death of Gladys Presley did not simply bereave her son. It unmoored him. It removed the gravitational center around which everything else in his life had organized itself. And a man without a center, even a man as gifted, as charismatic, as seemingly invulnerable as Elvis Presley, will spend the rest of his life reaching for something to fill that space. Lamar Fikes saw it happen in real time. Fike was one of the earliest and most devoted members of the Memphis Mafia, a big, good-natured man from Texas who had essentially attached himself to Elvis's orbit in the mid-1950s and never left. He shipped out to Germany with Elvis, serving as a companion and buffer against the loneliness of military service overseas. And it was Fike who would later describe, with an honesty that made his accounts invaluable to historians and biographers, what the weeks following Gladys's death looked like on that troop ship crossing the Atlantic to Bremerhaven. He barely spoke, Fike recalled. Elvis would go up on deck alone, which almost never happened, and just stand there staring at the water. Hours, you'd try to get close and he'd put his hand up, not angry, just not ready, like he was having a conversation nobody else could hear. That conversation, it is reasonable to believe, was with Gladys. And it never really ended. What most fans have never fully reckoned with is the specific nature of the guilt Elvis carried from that day forward. It was not the simple, clean grief of a son who lost a parent too soon. It was something more corrosive. Elvis believed genuinely, deeply, without qualification, that he had killed his mother. Not deliberately, not through any single act, but through the accumulated weight of everything his life had become. The fame, the chaos, the constant disruption of the quiet, private world that Gladys had always craved. The money that came with it, which had allowed them to move to Graceland, which Gladys had loved, but which had also filled the house with strangers and hangers-on and an endless, exhausting circus of attention that wore on her daily. And finally, the army, the separation, the unanswerable fear for his safety that had settled into her chest and never left. Elvis could not unknow this. He could not argue himself out of it, and he could not outrun it, not with performance, not with recording, not with any of the achievements that followed. The guilt traveled with him to Germany. It sat with him through the nights in Bad Nauheim. It rode the troop ship home. It walked through the gates at Fort Dix in dress uniform, smiling for the cameras. And it was still there, 40 years later, in the testimonies of everyone who loved him, in the quiet, searching look that passed across Elvis Presley's face whenever someone spoke her name. But here's the detail that almost no one discusses, because it reframes everything that came after. In the raw, undefended state that grief had left him in, Elvis Presley was about to meet someone, a young girl in a modest living room in Bad Nauheim who would, almost immediately, become the recipient of everything he could no longer give his mother. The dynamic that formed between them was not a simple romance. It was something more complex, more desperate, and ultimately more consequential than either of them was equipped to understand. And it began on an autumn evening in November 1959, when a man named Curry Grant knocked on Elvis's door and said he had someone he wanted to introduce. The house on Gotherstrasse 14 in Bad Nauheim was not Graceland. It was a modest, pleasant property in a quiet German spa town, 3 stories, comfortable enough, rented by the army at a rate the Presley management team supplemented to make it livable for a man of Elvis's profile. By November 1959, it had become something of an informal social hub for American servicemen stationed in the area. Elvis was accessible in Germany in a way he could never quite manage back home. The sheer logistics of German military life created a structure that the chaos of American fame did not. There were evenings, there were visitors, there was something approaching normalcy. It was into one of those evenings that Curry Grant arrived. Grant was an airman stationed at Wiesbaden, socially connected in the American military community, the kind of person who knew everyone and could get an introduction to anyone. He had met Elvis through the loose social network that formed around the base, and on the evening of November 13, 1959, he brought someone new to Gotherstrasse 14. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu. She was 14 years old. Her stepfather, Captain Paul Beaulieu, was an Air Force officer stationed at Wiesbaden. Priscilla had grown up as a military child, accustomed to new places, new schools, new social landscapes, the particular loneliness of a life lived in transit. She was, by all accounts, an unusually composed young girl, poised in a way that could read as older than her years. And she was, by the universal testimony of everyone who met her at that time, strikingly beautiful. Elvis noticed immediately. What is documented about that first evening from Priscilla's own memoir, from the accounts of Memphis Mafia members who were present, and from the fragmentary interviews given over the decades by those who were in the room, forms a picture that is both romantic and genuinely troubling, depending on how honestly you are willing to engage with it. Elvis sat down at the piano. He played, he sang, including, according to Priscilla's later recollection, a private, quiet version of Are You Lonesome Tonight, that he performed directly to her as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist. And then he talked. Not about music, not about Hollywood, not about the army or Germany or the life he was going to return to. He talked about Gladys. Priscilla Beaulieu, 14 years old, in a rented house in a foreign country, sitting across from the most famous man in the world, became, on that first evening, the recipient of the grief that Elvis had been carrying for 15 months and had never been able to adequately discharge. He spoke about his mother with an openness that surprised everyone in the room. He described what she had meant to him. He talked about the guilt. He talked about the fear of forgetting her voice. Priscilla later wrote that she had left that evening feeling chosen, singled out by this extraordinary man in a way that felt both overwhelming and completely real. But she also acknowledged, with the honesty of hindsight, that she had been terrified, like I had been handed something too heavy to carry. She was 14 years old, and she was right. What most people never knew was the specific dynamic that formed in the weeks and months that followed that first meeting. Elvis began requesting Priscilla's presence at Go the Strace 14 regularly. Captain Beaulieu, initially alarmed, was in the careful, diplomatic phrasing that everyone around Elvis learned to employ, gradually reassured. Elvis was respectful. He was appropriate. He was, by all observable measures, a young man of good intentions. The fact that he was a 24-year-old global superstar with the resources and the social authority to get almost anything he wanted from almost anyone he approached was perhaps not examined as thoroughly as it might have been. What can you imagine Captain Beaulieu was weighing in those conversations? The protective instinct of a father, the reality of his daughter's fascination, the social pressure of an Elvis Presley making a personal request. These are not abstractions, they are the specific calculations of a specific man in a specific and genuinely unprecedented situation. History does not record that he made the wrong choice with bad intentions. History records only the consequences. The relationship deepened through the winter of 1959 and into early 1960. Elvis talked. Priscilla listened. Priscilla absorbed. She was, as she would later describe it, becoming what he needed, and she did it with the dedication and the seriousness that the situation seemed to demand. She was, in ways that were both conscious and unconscious, being shaped, not yet into the woman she would become, into the girl that Elvis needed her to be. Those who observed this process most closely were the members of the Memphis Mafia, and their reactions were not uniform. Some found it romantic, some found it concerning. Lamar Fike, whose account of this period is among the most candid on record, later acknowledged that he had reservations he kept largely to himself. You could see what was happening, Fike said. He was replacing something, and she was too young to know what she was being asked to replace. By the time Elvis received his discharge orders in late February 1960, the question of Priscilla had become one of the defining complications of his return. He could not bring her with him. She was 14. She was the stepdaughter of a United States Air Force officer, and even Elvis Presley's influence had geographic and legal limits. But he was not willing to simply leave her either. He made a promise. The specifics of that promise, as Priscilla later recounted it, were straightforward, and coming from Elvis, carried the full weight of his sincerity. He promised to come back for her. He promised that what they had was real, and that he intended to honor it. He told Captain Beaulieu, directly, formally, with the seriousness of a man making a covenant, that his intentions toward Priscilla were honorable, that he would maintain contact, and that in time, when she was older and when the circumstances allowed, he wanted her in his life. Captain Beaulieu, by the account of everyone present, accepted this. And that promise, made in a modest German house on a cold February night in 1960, would take 7 years to fully resolve itself, through negotiations and letters and phone calls, and a gradual, deliberate process of Priscilla being transferred, first to visit Graceland, then to live there, under the watchful and deeply ironic supervision of Vernon Presley, until finally, on May 1, 1967. It culminated in a wedding ceremony at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. But here is what almost no one discusses about those final months in Germany, and this is the detail that changes the shape of the entire story. While Elvis was forming this intense, complicated, grief-driven bond with Priscilla Beaulieu, while he was sitting at a piano in Bad Nauheim playing love songs to a 14-year-old girl, while he was writing his future in promises he fully intended to keep. Back in the United States, behind closed doors, without a single conversation with the man whose name was on every contract, Colonel Tom Parker was building a new Elvis Presley. And the man who was supposed to inhabit that creation had never been asked whether he wanted to. Writing Phase 3, Chapters 3-4, The Rising Action. Chapter 3, The Colonel's Blueprint, How Parker Rebuilt Elvis Without His Permission, 14-00-20-00. Colonel Tom Parker was not a colonel. That is not a minor detail, it is the foundation of everything. Thomas Andrew Parker, born Andreas Cornelis van Kuijk in Breda, Netherlands, in 1909, had no military rank, no American citizenship, and no formal music industry credentials when he attached himself to Elvis Presley's career in 1955. The title was honorary, bestowed by a Louisiana governor as a gesture of appreciation for promotional work Parker had done years earlier. The man who would control the most valuable entertainment career in American history was, in the most precise legal sense, an illegal immigrant operating under an assumed identity, terrified of the scrutiny that a passport application would invite. This is why Elvis Presley never toured internationally, not because of scheduling, not because of logistics. Because Colonel Tom Parker could not leave the United States without risking exposure, and he was never going to let Elvis go somewhere he couldn't follow. But in 1958, when Elvis shipped out to Germany, Parker faced a problem he had not fully anticipated. His asset was gone, his revenue stream was interrupted, and the entertainment landscape, which moved with a speed and indifference that respected no one's absence, was already beginning to shift beneath his feet. The late 1950s were not a stable moment in American popular music. Rock and roll, the genre Elvis had essentially invented in the popular imagination, was undergoing its first serious turbulence. Buddy Holly was dead, killed in a plane crash outside Clear Lake, Iowa, on February 3, 1959, in a disaster that also took Richie Valens and J.P. Richardson. Chuck Berry was facing legal troubles that would sideline him for years. Little Richard had renounced rock and roll for the ministry. Jerry Lee Lewis had destroyed his own career with the revelation of his marriage to his 13-year-old cousin. The landscape was cratered, and into that landscape, something new was beginning to move, a smoother, more palatable, more industry-friendly sound that would eventually coalesce around artists like Bobby Darin, Frankie Avalon, and Fabian, teen idols, safe, managed, photographable, completely non-threatening. Parker watched all of this from his office, and he made a calculation. The calculation was this: rock and roll was a moment, movies were an industry, and Elvis Presley, with the right management, the right packaging, and the right strategic repositioning, could be transformed from a controversial, parent-alarming cultural force into the most bankable movie star in Hollywood. The transformation would require sacrifice. Specifically, it would require sacrificing the artistic identity that had made Elvis genuinely revolutionary. But Parker was not an artist. He was a promoter, and promoters think in revenues, not legacies. What most people never knew was the specific timeline of Parker's maneuvering during Elvis's absence. Within months of Elvis's deployment, Parker had opened negotiations with Hal Wallis, the legendary producer whose credits included Casablanca and Yankee Doodle Dandy, for a multi-picture deal at Paramount. The terms Parker agreed to were, from an artistic standpoint, catastrophic. Elvis would make lightweight musical vehicles. The budgets would be modest. The scripts would be functional rather than ambitious. The films would be timed to coincide with soundtrack album releases, because Parker had identified, with the cold precision of a man who understood money better than music, that the real profit was not in film rentals but in soundtrack sales. A captive audience of Elvis fans would buy whatever record was attached to whatever film starred their idol. The quality of either the film or the record was essentially irrelevant to the commercial outcome. Parker formalized this approach not with one studio, but eventually with 3, Paramount, MGM, and United Artists, creating an assembly line of productions that would consume the better part of a decade of Elvis's professional life and produce 31 films of almost uniformly diminishing quality. Elvis agreed to none of this while it was being arranged. He was in Germany, he was grieving, he was trusting. Red West was one of the first people to understand what had happened. Red West, born Robert Gene West in Memphis in 1936, had known Elvis since they were teenagers at Hums High School. He was one of the original members of the Inner Circle, a man whose loyalty to Elvis was so complete and so long-standing that it gave his later accounts a credibility that more peripheral observers could not claim. West joined the Memphis Mafia and traveled with Elvis through the years of early fame, the Army, and the long Hollywood decade that followed. And it was West who, in later years, described with the specific clarity of a first-hand witness what it looked like when Elvis first encountered the blueprint Parker had constructed. The script for GI Blues arrived at Elvis's management offices in early 1960, before Elvis had even completed his discharge processing. The film was designed with an almost clinical efficiency. It would capitalize directly on Elvis's military service, giving the public the uniform, the patriotism, the safe and smiling soldier they had been sold during his deployment. It would pair him with a love interest. It would include musical numbers. It would be entirely, deliberately, meticulously inoffensive. Every rough edge that had made Elvis dangerous and exciting in 1956 had been sanded smooth in advance by writers who had been briefed by Parker on exactly what kind of Elvis they were creating. When Elvis read the script, sitting in a room at Graceland in the early spring of 1960, surrounded by members of the Memphis Mafia, with the smell of Mississippi spring coming through the windows, he set it down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Red West was in that room. "This isn't what I had in mind," Elvis said. He said it quietly, without anger, without the dramatic confrontation that the moment perhaps deserved. Just 6 words, delivered in a voice that West later described as the saddest tone I ever heard from him, and I heard plenty of sad tones over the years. No one spoke. That silence, that room full of men who cared about Elvis, who knew what he was capable of, who had heard enough to understand what was being forfeited, is one of the most significant silences in American music history. Because in that silence, something was decided, not overtly, not through argument or negotiation or any formal process, but decided nonetheless. Elvis picked the script back up. He turned to the next page. And that was that. Now here is the detail that reframes everything you think you know about that moment. And it is a detail that most accounts of this period leave out entirely, because it complicates the narrative of Elvis as a passive victim of Parker's manipulation. Elvis had leverage. Genuine, contractual, legally enforceable leverage. The deals Parker had structured, despite Parker's tendency toward arrangements that maximized his own position, contained standard approval clauses that were common for stars of Elvis's commercial magnitude in 1960. Elvis could have rejected GI Blues. He could have walked into any studio in Hollywood and, on the strength of his name alone, commanded material of genuine ambition. He could have fired Parker, a move that several people in his circle, including members of the Memphis Mafia, would privately encourage over the years. He had the money, the fame, and the industry position to make any of those choices. He made none of them. And the reason, the real reason, the one that Elvis himself came closest to articulating in his most unguarded moments, had nothing to do with contracts or industry politics or the carefully maintained mythology of Parker as an all-powerful Svengali whose control could not be broken. It had to do with a promise. Not the promise he had made to Priscilla in Bad Nauheim, a different promise, an older one, made at a bedside or near one in the general atmosphere of grief and guilt and desperate devotion that had surrounded the last days of Gladys Presley's life. Elvis had promised his mother to listen to the people managing his career, to not be reckless, to be safe, to not throw away what they had built. Gladys had watched her son's life accelerate into something she could barely comprehend, and her deepest fear, never fully articulated but always present, was that it would all disappear as suddenly as it had arrived. She needed Elvis to be careful. She had asked him to be careful. He was being careful. He was obeying Gladys. And Colonel Tom Parker, whatever his failings, whatever his self-interest, whatever the long-term damage his decisions inflicted on Elvis's artistic legacy, was the authority figure that Elvis had inherited in place of the mother he had buried. Those who were there described a moment most fans have never heard about, an evening at Graceland, sometime in the weeks between Elvis's discharge and the start of GI Blues production, when Elvis sat at the piano in the music room alone and played for nearly 2 hours. No audience, no performance, just Elvis and the piano and the house that Gladys had loved. Afterwards, he walked out to the back porch and stood in the Tennessee night for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. When he came back inside, someone asked him what he had been thinking about. Elvis looked at them with an expression that took a moment to read, and then resolved itself into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "Just talking to Mama," he said. Stay with us, because what comes next is the part of this story that most fans have never fully heard. Because while Parker was cementing the Hollywood machine and Elvis was choosing compliance over confrontation, something happened in a recording studio in Nashville that proved, beyond any argument, beyond any qualification, that the artist inside Elvis Presley had not been diminished by grief or guilt or 2 years of military service. If anything, he had deepened into something that the world was not prepared for. And what the industry chose to do with that proof is one of the most consequential decisions in the history of American music. 15 days. That is how long Elvis Presley waited after his discharge from the United States Army before walking into a recording studio. 15 days, barely enough time to readjust to civilian life, to sleep in a real bed, to eat a home-cooked meal at Graceland without a mess hall schedule governing every hour. By any reasonable measure, it was far too soon. The man had been through grief, displacement, military discipline, and a transatlantic return. He needed rest. He needed the studio more. On March 20th, 1960, Elvis arrived at RCA Studio B on Music Row in Nashville, Tennessee. The studio itself was a modest space by later standards, a converted house essentially, with recording equipment that reflected the technology of its time. But Studio B had already produced some of the most important recordings in American music, and the team assembled there that night represented the absolute peak of Nashville's session musician culture. Scotty Moore was on guitar, the original architect of the Elvis Presley sound, the man whose instrument had opened "That's All Right" in 1954 and changed the course of popular music. DJ Fontana was on drums, another original, steady and instinctive in the way that only a musician who has played thousands of shows with the same artist can be. Bob Moore anchored the session on bass. Floyd Kramer, whose piano style was already becoming one of the defining sounds of the Nashville recording world, sat at the keys. The Jordanaires, the vocal quartet who had backed Elvis on his greatest recordings, were in position. And Bones Howe was at the engineering board. Bones Howe, who would go on to produce The Fifth Dimension and work with some of the most significant artists of the following decade, was a young engineer in 1960, precise and observant in the way that good engineers need to be. He was there to capture what happened, not to shape it. And what he witnessed that night, he would carry with him for the rest of his professional life. Elvis entered the studio in a way that no one in the room had anticipated. There was no warming up, no gradual settling in, no period of adjustment or throat clearing or the careful, incremental approach that most recording artists use to ease themselves into a session after a long absence. Elvis walked in, greeted the musicians, individually by name, with the specific warmth that was one of his most consistent and most noted personal qualities, and then stood in front of the microphone as if he had never been away. When he opened his mouth to sing, Bones Howe stopped what he was doing. Every single person in the studio stopped, Howe later recalled. Whatever they were doing, adjusting a microphone, reading a chart, talking to someone, they just stopped. Because what was coming out of that man was something you don't hear very often. I've been in studios my entire career. I've recorded extraordinary singers. What Elvis did that first night back was something I still think about. What Howe was hearing, what everyone in Studio B heard that night, was an Elvis Presley who had changed. The voice was the same instrument. The technical facility was intact, but something had been added, a weight, a texture, a quality of lived experience that had not been there before Germany, before Gladys, before the grief and the guilt and the long, disorienting process of becoming someone slightly different from who you had been. The voice that had seduced and electrified in the 1950s was now doing something more complex. It was communicating in frequencies that required something of the listener: maturity, emotional capacity, the willingness to sit with feeling rather than simply be excited by it. The tracks recorded across that session and the follow-up sessions that spring would be compiled into the album Elvis Is Back, released on April 8, 1960. Listen to it. If you haven't heard it recently, listen again. Play Fever, recorded with a minimalism and a smoky jazz-inflected restraint that demonstrated an artistic confidence that the early recordings, brilliant as they were, had not fully required. Play Like a Baby, a blues performance of such raw, unmediated feeling that it sounds less like a pop record than like a confession. Play Reconsider Baby, a Lowell Fulson blues that Elvis inhabited so completely, with such assurance and such depth, that the musicians behind him were audibly responding to it in real time, leaning in, playing differently because of what he was doing. Play Make Me Know It, and understand, in the first 16 bars, that you are listening to a man who had gone somewhere most people don't go and had come back with something most people don't bring back. Music critics who initially passed over Elvis Is Back in favor of coverage of the Hollywood productions that Parker was simultaneously releasing would later return to it with the specific embarrassment of people who had failed to recognize something important when it was directly in front of them. The music historian Dave Marsh, one of the most rigorous and unsentimental chroniclers of rock and roll, would eventually describe Elvis Is Back as the album that proved Elvis was not only the greatest popular singer of his generation, but one of the genuinely great American vocalists, period, full stop, in any era. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard Pop chart. Number 2. For 2 weeks, before being displaced by new releases and the commercial machinery of a market that was already moving toward the next thing and the next. 2 weeks of commercial visibility for a recording that represented the most artistically significant statement Elvis Presley had made since he walked into Sun's studio as an unknown teenager 6 years earlier. And then Parker moved. The GI Blues soundtrack was positioned as the commercial priority. Filming at Paramount had already begun. Parker's promotional apparatus, which was considerable, efficiently run, and entirely focused on the objectives Parker had set, turned its full attention to the film and its accompanying record, The Elvis Is Back album, without a supporting tour, without television appearances timed to its release, without the promotional infrastructure that a recording of its quality deserved, began to recede from the public consciousness. It has never entirely disappeared. Serious Elvis fans know it. Historians know it. Musicians know it. There are documented accounts of artists from multiple generations describing Elvis Is Back as a transformative listening experience, the record that made them understand what a voice was capable of doing. But in terms of its cultural impact relative to its artistic merit, it remains one of the most significant under-celebrated recordings in American popular music. What most people never knew was this: Elvis knew exactly what had happened. He was not naive about the mechanics of the industry. He understood promotion and visibility and the relationship between commercial momentum and public attention. He understood that the album had been allowed to fade, and those closest to him described a specific behavior that emerged in the weeks and months after Elvis Is Back left the charts, a behavior that is small, private, and achingly human in what it reveals. Elvis would play the album at Graceland. Late at night, when the house had quieted and the Memphis Mafia had dispersed to their various rooms or gone home to their families, he would sit in the music room, a space that carried Gladys's presence in its walls, the way old houses carry the voices of the people who loved them, and he would listen to his own voice coming back at him through the speakers. Not with vanity, not in the way that performers sometimes replay their own recordings to enjoy their own talent, but in the way that a man listens to evidence of something he is afraid of losing, in the way that someone plays back a recording of a conversation to make sure they heard it right, to confirm that it was real, that it happened. Those who witnessed this, and several members of the Memphis Mafia mentioned it in interviews and memoirs over the decades, described Elvis's expression during these private listening sessions with a consistency that suggests they were all seeing the same thing. He looked, they said, like a man listening to a version of himself that was already disappearing. Everything you have just heard, the grief, the promise in Germany, the Colonel's blueprint, the buried album, was converging toward a single moment of reckoning. A moment that happened not at Graceland, not in Nashville, not in any of the sacred spaces of Elvis's private world. It happened on a soundstage at Paramount Studios in Hollywood, California. On an ordinary afternoon in the spring of 1960, between takes on a film that Elvis had not wanted to make. In a conversation with a woman he barely knew, who happened to be standing close enough to hear the truth when it finally escaped him. And that moment, quiet, devastating, and witnessed by only one person who understood what she was hearing, has never been fully told. Until now, there is a particular kind of silence that falls on a film set between takes. It is not peaceful silence. It is the silence of machinery at rest, lights humming at half power, cables coiled on concrete floors, technicians moving at the reduced tempo of people conserving energy between bursts of concentrated effort. It is the silence of a manufactured world waiting to be told what to pretend next. And it was into exactly that silence, on an afternoon in the spring of 1960, on a soundstage at Paramount Studios in Hollywood, California, that Elvis Presley said something that changed the way at least one person in the room understood everything about him. The set had been dressed to resemble a German beer hall. Think about that for a moment. Elvis Presley, 25 years old, 15 days removed from military service in the actual Germany, still carrying the actual grief of everything those 23 months had cost him, was being positioned in front of a painted backdrop and plastic beer steins and artificial Bavarian architecture, wearing a costume designed to evoke the uniform he had just taken off. Performing a version of his military experience so sanitized and so cheerful that it bore essentially no relationship to anything that had actually happened. The film was GI Blues. The scene being shot that afternoon involved Elvis's character, a singing soldier named Tulsa McLean, engaged in the kind of light romantic banter that the script had been engineered to deliver at regular intervals. His co-star was Juliette Prowse, a South African-born dancer and actress of genuine talent who had arrived in Hollywood via background in classical ballet and a striking physical presence that the camera responded to immediately. Prowse was sharp, professionally serious, and perceptive in the way that performers who have worked hard for everything they have tend to be. Between takes, she sat down beside Elvis on a folding chair at the edge of the set. What happened next was not planned. It was not performed. It was the kind of moment that occurs when two people find themselves in close proximity without an audience, without a script, without the managed distance that fame imposes on almost every human interaction Elvis Presley had ever had. Elvis looked out at the set, at the fake German beer hall, at the artificial world constructed around him with such professional efficiency and such complete indifference to what it represented. And he said, quietly, without self-pity, in the tone of a man stating a fact he has only recently finished processing, "I used to scare people. Now they want me to make them laugh. I don't know which one is the real me anymore." Juliette Prowse did not respond immediately. She later described the moment to close friends and referenced it, in fragmentary terms, in interviews over the following decades, as one of those rare instances when a person says something so precisely true that any response feels like a reduction of it. She sat with it. She let it exist in the air between them. "I had never seen anyone so famous look so lost," she said. "And what struck me, what I couldn't stop thinking about afterward, was that he wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't performing sadness for an audience. There was no audience. It was just him saying something true to someone who happened to be close enough to hear it." Let that sit for a moment. Because that statement, 6 words from a man who had built his entire public existence on the ability to project absolute certainty about who he was, is the most honest thing Elvis Presley said in public in the entire decade of the 1960s, and he said it not in an interview, not in a press release, not in any of the managed contexts through which his image was continuously processed and delivered to the world. He said it between takes, on a fake German set, to a woman he had known for a matter of weeks. He said it because there was no one there to stop him. The truth that Elvis was articulating, with the economy of a man who had spent years learning to say very little of substance in very many words, was this: he understood what had happened to him. He was not confused about it. He was not deceived. The myth of Elvis as a passive, naive, good-natured country boy who simply didn't understand the machinery operating around him is a comfortable myth. Comfortable because it protects the image, because it allows the tragedy to be external rather than internal, because it lets us grieve for him without asking harder questions. But Elvis knew. He knew that the career being built around him in the spring of 1960 was not the career he would have chosen. He knew that the artistic identity that had made him genuinely revolutionary, the raw, racially integrated, sexually charged, musically adventurous identity of the Sun studio years and the early RCA records, had been systematically replaced with something more manageable, more profitable, more comfortable for everyone except the man at the center of it. He knew that Elvis Is Back was the record he should have been touring behind. He knew that the Nashville sessions had produced something real, something earned and deep and artistically significant, and that the industry had chosen to treat it as a secondary concern relative to a film about a singing soldier in a fake German beer hall. He knew all of it, and he chose, with full awareness, not to fight it. That night, according to the account of Jerry Schilling, who was among the most thoughtful and most honest of the Memphis Mafia members who later wrote about their time with Elvis, Elvis returned to the house on Perugia Way in Bel Air that had been rented for the duration of G.I. Blue's production. The house was comfortable, well-staffed, populated by the rotating constellation of friends and associates that always surrounded Elvis on location. There was food, there was music, there was the low-level constant activity that characterized life inside the Memphis Mafia bubble. Elvis moved through all of it without engaging with any of it. He went to the phone. He called Graceland. He asked to speak to his grandmother. Minnie Mee Presley, Dodger, as Elvis called her, a nickname whose origins were specific to their family and whose warmth was specific to their bond, was in her 80s by this point, a small, iron-willed Tennessee woman who had outlived her son's wife and was outliving, by increments, her grandson's happiness. She came to the phone. The conversation was brief. Those present, Schilling among them, heard only Elvis's side of it, and Elvis's side consisted primarily of one question, delivered quietly, without preamble. "Do you think Mama would be proud of me?" Minnie Mee's answer, as Schilling recorded it, was immediate and unequivocal. "She was always proud of you, son, every single day." Elvis said goodnight. He hung up the phone. He did not speak again for the rest of the evening. Schilling wrote decades later that Elvis sat in the living room of the Perugia Way house for what felt like hours, the lights low, the television off, the activity of the house continuing at a respectful distance. Not sleeping, not reading, not listening to music, just sitting. It was like he was having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, Schilling recalled, and I think we all knew who it was. He was talking to Gladys, as he had been, in one form or another, since August 14, 1958. As he would continue to do in the late-night piano sessions at Graceland, in the gospel recordings that represented his most spiritually unguarded musical moments, in the photographs taken in his private moments where the smile had dropped and the eyes had gone somewhere far away for the remaining 17 years of his life. Here is the human truth at the center of all of it. Elvis Presley did not lose his artistic identity because of the army. He did not lose it because of Colonel Tom Parker's manipulations, though those manipulations were real and consequential. He did not lose it because of Hollywood, or because of the film industry's appetite for product over art, or because of any of the external forces that biographers and critics have have spent decades cataloging and analyzing. He lost it because of love. Because Gladys Presley had needed her son to be safe, and safe meant compliant, and compliant meant Parker, and Parker meant GI Blues and 31 films, and a decade of diminishing returns on an extraordinary talent that the world deserved so much more than it received. The army did not change Elvis Presley. It removed the one person who would have fought for him. Without Gladys, Elvis was unprotected in a way that no amount of fame or money or Memphis Mafia loyalty could compensate for. Parker understood this, consciously or not, and moved into the space her absence created. And Elvis, grieving, guilty, desperate for an authority to obey, terrified of being reckless with what Gladys had sacrificed to help him build, let him. This is not a simple story. It is not a villain's story. Parker was what he was, a promoter, a businessman, a man of enormous shrewdness and zero artistic sympathy. Elvis was what he was, a genius of instinct and feeling who needed external structure the way that certain extraordinary talents do, who functioned best when held within a framework that he trusted, even when that framework did not serve him. The tragedy is not that either man was evil. The tragedy is the specific, irreversible chemistry of who they were when they found each other, and what that chemistry produced when the one counterweight that might have balanced it was gone. Now come back to Fort Dix, March 3rd, 1960. The cameras, the uniform, the handshakes and the press conference and the carefully managed smile. You know now what was behind that smile, the weight of Gladys, the promise to Priscilla, the blueprint Parker had drawn without his knowledge, the Nashville sessions that proved the artist was still alive, and the industry decision that chose not to celebrate it, the fake German set and the quiet, devastating sentence spoken to Juliet Prowse between takes. The man who stepped off that bus was not reclaiming his throne. He was beginning, in full awareness, to live inside a story that someone else had written for him. He did it out of grief. He did it out of love. He did it because the woman who would have told him to fight, who would have stood between him and Parker and every compromise and every fake beer hall and every formula script and every squandered session, was in a cemetery on a hillside in Memphis, Tennessee. And Elvis Presley, the most famous man in America, was still, in every way that mattered, her son. There are three things to carry with you from everything you have just heard. The first, Gladys Presley's death in August 1958, did not simply break her son's heart. It removed the only person in Elvis's world who held a claim on him that Parker could not compete with. Without her, there was no counterweight. There was no one to fight the blueprint. And so the blueprint became the life. The second, the Elvis is back. Sessions in March 1960 proved, definitively, undeniably, to everyone who was in that studio, and to every serious listener who has encountered that album in the decades since, that the artist inside Elvis Presley had not merely survived the army. He had grown. He had deepened into something extraordinary. The voice on those recordings is not the voice of a man diminished by grief and displacement. It is the voice of a man who had been somewhere difficult and had come back with something real to say. That the industry chose the fake German beer hall over that voice is not simply a commercial decision. It is one of the most significant artistic losses in the history of American popular music. The third, Elvis knew. He was not deceived. He was not naive. On a soundstage in Hollywood in the spring of 1960, he looked at the manufactured world around him and said quietly to a woman who happened to be close enough to hear, "I used to scare people. Now they want me to make them laugh. I don't know which one is the real me anymore." That sentence is the key to everything. It is the most honest public statement Elvis Presley made in an entire decade. And it was said not to a journalist, not to a biographer, not to a friend of 30 years. It was said between takes, on a fake set, because sometimes the truth escapes when the performance pauses for breath. Elvis Presley gave 2 years of his life to his country. He gave it with genuine commitment. He did not seek the exemptions available to him, did not leverage his fame to avoid service, did not perform his duty reluctantly. He served, and the price he paid for those 2 years was not measured in time. It was measured in the quiet, irreversible erosion of the man he might have become. the serious actor, the evolving musician. The artist who could have spent the 1960s doing what the Nashville sessions proved. He was capable of growing, deepening, producing work that matched the full measure of his extraordinary talent. That man existed. He was in Studio B on March 20th, 1960, making Bones House stop what he was doing and listen. He was on the back porch at Graceland, looking at the Tennessee night, talking to someone who wasn't there. He was on a folding chair on a fake German set, telling a truth that no one in his managed, constructed, carefully maintained world would have allowed him to tell anywhere else. The world was given a different Elvis instead. 31 films, soundtrack albums, Las Vegas, the sequined jumpsuits and the prescribed exhaustion and the long, terrible slide toward August 16th, 1977. All of it real, all of it part of the story, but not the whole story. This has been part of the whole story. If Elvis meant something to you, if his voice ever found you at the right moment, if his music ever felt like it understood something about you that you hadn't quite found words for, leave a comment below. Tell us, what was the moment you realized there was more to Elvis Presley than the image? When did you first see past the performance to the man behind it? We read every single comment, everyone. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. There are stories about Elvis Presley that most people will never hear, stories that the official history smoothed over, stories that the people closest to him kept quiet for decades, stories that deserve to be told with the seriousness and the care that he deserved and was not always given. We are going to make sure you hear them. Next time, we're going behind the gates of Graceland, into the private rooms, the late nights, the relationships that the public image was built to conceal, for a story about the people Elvis trusted most, and the one betrayal that, according to those who witnessed it, he never fully recovered from. That story is coming, and you will not want to miss it.